There is a moment, somewhere between 9:50 in the evening and 2:28 in the morning, where everything changed. Not loudly, not with sirens or shouting, or the kind of chaos that announces itself. It happened in the dark, in a quiet neighborhood in the foothills, north of Tucson, Arizona, on a street where the houses sit far apart and the nights are still enough to hear your own breathing. And by the time anyone understood what that silence was hiding, Nancy Guthrie was already gone. What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is not theory dressed up as fact. Every detail in this story comes from documented evidence, confirmed reporting, forensic analysis, and public statements made by investigators, federal agencies, and the leading DNA scientist in the United States. What makes this case different from almost any other disappearance covered in recent years is not the mystery. It is the science. And right now, in a federal laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, that science is closing in on an answer that one specific person does not know is coming. Stay with this, because what happened to Nancy Guthrie, and what is happening right now to find out who is responsible, is one of the most forensically significant investigations of 2026. And most people have only heard a fraction of the story. If this is your first time here, welcome to True Crime Files. We do not summarize, we go deep. Hit that subscribe button now so you never miss a case, and let's get into it. The Catalina Foothills is not the kind of neighborhood where things like this happen. Or at least, that is what the people who live there have always believed. It sits above Tucson in that way that money tends to sit above everything else. Elevated, quiet, insulated. The homes are set back from the roads. The landscaping is deliberate. The streets carry a particular kind of stillness at night that feels, depending on your perspective, either peaceful or isolated. Nancy Guthrie lived there. She was known in Tucson, genuinely known, the kind of visibility that comes from years of presence in a community, from the accumulated weight of a life lived publicly enough to matter to people beyond her immediate circle. Hers was not a name that needed introduction in southern Arizona. It was a name that carried context. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, she was home. At 9:50 p.m., the last confirmed moment of normalcy is documented. Whatever happened after that point, in the hours that followed, in the darkness of a Tucson night that would eventually become the morning of February 1st, began to unfold without witnesses, without alarm, without any of the external signals that might have brought help sooner. The window between 9:50 p.m. and 2:28 a.m. is where the story lives. 4 hours and 38 minutes. And inside that window, someone came to Nancy Guthrie's door. At 1:47 in the morning, on February 1st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera recorded something. A figure approached the front door. The figure was dressed entirely in black. Every visible surface covered, gloves on both hands, a face covering that left nothing identifiable exposed. The figure was carrying bags, and from the footage, from the detail that investigators and forensic experts have returned to again and again in the weeks since, the figure was holding something in their mouth, a bite flashlight. It is a specific tool, the kind used by people who need their hands free in low light conditions. You clip it between your teeth. The light projects forward. Your hands stay available for whatever work you are doing. This person had planned. The gloves were not incidental. The face covering was not a coincidence. The camera disabling, which would become a documented part of what investigators recovered, was deliberate. This approach to Nancy Guthrie's front door at 1:47 in the morning was the result of preparation. Someone had thought carefully about how to arrive at that house without leaving the kinds of evidence that get people caught. They wore gloves. They covered their face. They came with equipment, but they held a flashlight between their teeth. And that one automatic, unthinking, functional act, the kind of thing a person does without thinking because their hands are full and they need to see, may have deposited their DNA on an object still sitting in an evidence locker right now, waiting to give investigators the name they have been working toward for 79 days. We will come back to the flashlight, because before this story ends, it is going to matter more than almost anything else. Nancy Guthrie's blood was found on her front porch, not inside the home. On the porch, in front of the door, on the same surface where the masked figure in black had stood at 1:47 in the morning. That detail, confirmed and documented, tells you something specific about the sequence of events. The physical confrontation did not begin inside. It began outside, on her own front porch, before she was brought through the door and into whatever happened next. Nancy Guthrie bled on the concrete outside her own home on the night she disappeared. That is not an assumption. That is a forensic fact. Inside the home, investigators found more. They found biological material that did not match Nancy Guthrie, did not match any member of her family, did not match anyone with any documented, authorized access to that property. Sheriff Chris Nanos of the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the man who became the public voice of this investigation, addressed it directly. He described it as, in his words, potentially the suspect's DNA. One unknown person's biological contribution, found inside Nancy Guthrie's home, genetically documented and waiting for identification. But the biology did not stop there. Inside that home, investigators also found a hair sample from a location within the property that has not been publicly disclosed. They found biological material on a bedsheet, a specific cutting taken from a bedsheet in a way that tells you immediately that investigators found something on it that demanded forensic attention. And they found what forensic scientists describe as a mixed sample, DNA from multiple contributors, layered on top of each other in a way that standard analysis cannot cleanly separate. Nancy Guthrie, plus 2 or more unknowns, at least one confirmed male. That is the forensic landscape of the crime scene as of February 1, 2026. 7 distinct layers of biological evidence, each one telling a different part of the same story about what happened in that home between 9:50 in the evening and 2:28 in the morning. And then, approximately 2 meters from the front of the home, investigators found a glove, visually consistent with the gloves worn by the figure captured on the doorbell camera. 7 layers of evidence, 7 forensic stories, and every single one of them is still being worked. Within days of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, some reporting suggests within the first week, the Federal Bureau of Investigation made a formal request: transfer the biological evidence to us. This was not an unusual request, given the nature of the crime. Kidnapping is a federal offense under what is known as the Lindbergh Law, legislation that places federal jurisdiction over kidnapping cases the moment certain conditions are met. The moment Nancy Guthrie potentially crossed a state line, the moment any interstate communication was used in connection with her disappearance, the FBI's authority in this case became primary, not supplementary, not advisory, primary. Their interest in controlling the forensic evidence from the beginning was not bureaucratic overreach. It was legally and investigatively appropriate. The FBI laboratory at Quantico, Virginia, has capabilities that no private contractor can match. They knew that, and they formally asked for the evidence. The Pima County Sheriff's Department made a different decision. They had a contracted private forensic laboratory in Florida, a laboratory whose protocols they knew, whose results they trusted, whose working relationship with their department had been established over time. In the immediate aftermath of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the biological evidence collected from her home, the hair, the bedsheet cutting, the mixed samples, the other key biological materials, was sent to that Florida laboratory, not to Quantico, to Florida. Reuters reported this in February 2026, citing a source with direct knowledge of the investigation. The FBI had formally requested the evidence. The Sheriff's Department had sent it to their contractor in Florida instead. And the FBI, one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies on earth, waited. They waited for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of press conferences from the Pima County Sheriff's Department. 11 weeks of carefully worded statements about active investigations and ongoing analysis and coordinated partnerships. 11 weeks of tip lines and reward announcements and the particular language that law enforcement uses when they are managing both an investigation and a public that desperately wants answers. And then, April 15, 2026 arrived, day 74 of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Brian Entin is a reporter for News Nation who has covered the Nancy Guthrie case more consistently and more persistently than any other journalist in America. He has been the boots-on-the-ground reporter for this investigation from the beginning, filing from Tucson, from the Catalina foothills neighborhood, from the Pima County Sheriff's Department headquarters, where Sheriff Nanos has been making his statements. On April 15th, Brian Entin filed a report, but he was not in Tucson when he filed it. He was not at the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, where Nancy Guthrie's home sits quiet and undisturbed. He was not at the Sheriff's Department headquarters. He was standing outside a building in Virginia. And what he reported was this: DNA evidence from Nancy Guthrie's home had been transferred from the private forensic laboratory in Florida to the FBI laboratory at Quantico, Virginia, for advanced analysis. The evidence included hair samples found inside the home, a cutting from a bedsheet collected inside the home, and other key biological materials. The move, he described, was a significant development in the forensic investigation. The FBI laboratory's capabilities exceeded those of the private Florida lab that had been processing the evidence since February. 4 sentences. Clean, verified, sourced from investigators with direct knowledge of the case. That was the story he broke. What 4 sentences on a television news segment cannot contain is everything that story actually means: the why, the how, the 11-week conflict behind it, the science that makes Quantico different from every other forensic facility in the country, and the specific analytical processes that are happening right now with the evidence that just arrived. That is what this story is actually about. When ABC News contacted the FBI for comment on Brian Entin's report, the FBI did something that federal law enforcement agencies almost never do in an active investigation. They corrected the public record, not with diplomatic hedging, not with the careful, non-committal language that agencies use when they want to acknowledge something without actually saying anything. With a statement that was precise, pointed, and impossible to misread, the FBI said, "There is no new DNA evidence in the Nancy Guthrie case." The FBI requested this material over 2 months ago. The Pima County Sheriff's Office sent it to a private lab in Florida. 11 weeks later, that lab has now transferred an original hair sample to the FBI laboratory for testing. We remain fully committed to this investigation. Read those words carefully, because every sentence is doing specific work. There is no new evidence. The material that Brian Entin reported as a significant development is not new. It has existed since February. It was collected in the first hours of this investigation. The FBI is not announcing a discovery. They are announcing that evidence they formally requested 74 days ago has finally arrived. The FBI requested this material over 2 months ago, not suggested, not informally indicated an interest in, formally requested. 2 months before the transfer happened, the Pima County Sheriff's Office sent it to a private lab in Florida, not to the FBI, to Florida. 11 weeks later, that lab has now transferred the evidence. 11 weeks after a formal federal request, the evidence arrived at Quantico. That statement is a rebuke, measured, institutional, carefully constructed in the language of an organization that calculates every public word, but a rebuke nonetheless. And the fact that the FBI chose to issue it publicly, in an active investigation involving a nationally known victim, tells you something about the depth of the friction that existed between these two agencies over the handling of this evidence. The Pima County Sheriff's Department responded with their own statement. They said everything had been coordinated from the beginning, that the Florida laboratory had been sharing information with the FBI and partner labs throughout the process. That DNA analysis remained ongoing. 2 agencies, 2 statements, 2 completely different versions of the same 11 weeks. The specific dates of the requests, the specific reasons for the delay, the exact decision-making process that kept evidence in Florida while the FBI waited. None of that has entered the public record. It probably will not until the investigation concludes and the full accounting begins. But the conflict was real. The FBI's public statement confirms it. And 11 weeks is not a coordination delay. 11 weeks is a dispute. If you are going to understand why the transfer of this evidence to Quantico is the single most significant forensic development in the Nancy Guthrie investigation since February 1, 2026, you need to understand what the FBI laboratory at Quantico actually is. The FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, is the largest crime laboratory in the world. It has operated continuously since 1932. It processes evidence from the most complex, highest priority federal investigations in the United States, and increasingly from international cases where foreign law enforcement agencies request assistance. It employs hundreds of scientists, forensic examiners, and technical specialists across dozens of specialized units, each one dedicated to a specific category of forensic analysis. For DNA evidence specifically, the FBI laboratory's capabilities fall into several distinct categories that private forensic contractors cannot fully replicate. The first is what you might call raw, analytical infrastructure. When DNA evidence arrives at Quantico, it enters a chain of analytical steps that are documented, reviewed, validated, and defensible in any federal court in the country. The equipment, the protocols, the quality assurance systems, the redundancy built into every stage of the process, these exceed what any private laboratory can provide. This is not simply about getting a result from the evidence. It is about getting a result that can withstand legal scrutiny at the highest levels of the American judicial system. Every step is built for the courtroom, as much as for the laboratory. The second capability, and this one matters enormously for the specific challenge of the Nancy Guthrie case, is probabilistic genotyping. The FBI laboratory uses software systems called STR-Mix and True Allele. These are computational tools that use Bayesian statistical modeling to analyze complex mixed DNA samples that contain contributions from multiple people, and calculate the probability that specific genetic markers belong to specific contributors within that mixture. The mixed sample found inside Nancy Guthrie's home, the one containing Nancy plus 2 or more unknowns, including at least one confirmed male, has been the central forensic challenge of this investigation since February. Too complex for standard DNA analysis, too layered for the tools available at a private forensic contractor in Florida. Probabilistic genotyping is the solution to that problem, and the FBI laboratory's implementation of that software is the most sophisticated and well-validated in the country. The third capability is the one that could break this case open entirely: investigative genealogy. The technique was developed and pioneered by a scientist named C.E.C. Moore, chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs. The methodology does not require a match in a criminal database. It does not require that the person responsible has ever been arrested, convicted, or had any contact with the criminal justice system. What it requires is a DNA profile from an unknown contributor and access to the public genealogy databases where millions of ordinary people have voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry and family history. Platforms like Ancestry and 23andMe and GEDmatch, databases that collectively contain over 40 million profiles as of 2026, a number that grows every single month as more people order consumer DNA kits out of simple personal curiosity. When an unknown contributor's DNA profile is submitted to these databases, the matching algorithms search for genetic relatives, not the person themselves, relatives, cousins, second cousins, third cousins once removed, people who share enough genetic material to establish a family connection without being the same individual. When those relatives are identified, C.E.C. Moore's team begins building family trees, generation by generation, record by record, working forward and backward through genealogical documentation until the unknown contributor can be identified as a specific living person. This is the method that identified the Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who evaded identification for more than 40 years, was identified in 2018 through investigative genetic genealogy, using a DNA sample from evidence he left at crime scenes decades earlier. C.C. Moore built the family tree that led to his name. The FBI established a formal investigative genealogy unit in 2019, specifically designed to apply this methodology to federal investigations. That unit has a formal, coordinated partnership with Parabon Nanolabs, with C.C. Moore's team. When the FBI laboratory finishes processing a DNA profile for genealogical submission, the transition to Moore's team is described as seamless, fast, and coordinated. That unit now has access to the DNA evidence from Nancy Guthrie's home. That is what Brian Entin's 4 sentences actually mean. Before this video goes any further, if you are finding this breakdown valuable, if you are the kind of person who wants the full picture rather than the headline, This is the moment to subscribe to True Crime Files and leave a like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel continue doing this kind of work. Now let's keep going, because what comes next is where the forensic picture gets specific. The hair collected from inside Nancy Guthrie's home is now at Quantico, and understanding what that hair might tell investigators requires understanding a distinction that most coverage of this evidence has not explained. Hair evidence is not uniformly useful. Its forensic value depends almost entirely on one physical characteristic, whether the root is attached, a hair shaft alone, the visible part of a hair, the strand you would find on a pillow or a piece of clothing, is made of dead cells. Dead cells contain a type of DNA called mitochondrial DNA, which is maternally inherited and shared by every person in a maternal line. Mitochondrial DNA can connect evidence to a maternal genetic group. It cannot identify a specific individual. It is, forensically speaking, limited in ways that matter significantly to an investigation trying to identify one specific person. A hair with an intact root is something else entirely. When a hair is pulled from the scalp, when it comes out with the follicle still attached, the root contains living cells with nuclei. And those nuclei contain complete nuclear DNA, the same complete genetic profile you would recover from a blood sample. A single hair with an intact root can produce a full STR profile. It can generate the same quality of forensic information as any other biological evidence type collected at this scene. Stacey Moore assessed this evidence publicly. She indicated that she believes the hair found inside Nancy Guthrie's home may represent a potentially clean single-source contribution, meaning it is not part of the complex mixed sample with its multiple overlapping contributors. It may represent one person, one clear, complete, individual genetic profile. If she is right, and if the root is intact, the FBI laboratory can generate a full DNA profile from that hair within weeks under their priority processing protocols. No probabilistic genotyping required. No complex computational modeling to separate overlapping contributors. A straightforward extraction, leading to a complete individual profile, ready for CODIS submission, and, if CODIS returns no match, ready for genealogical analysis. That is the potential of the hair. Now consider the bedsheet, because it is the piece of evidence that almost nobody has focused on, and it may be the most forensically revealing item in this entire transfer. Investigators collected a cutting from a bedsheet found inside Nancy Guthrie's home. The exact location within the home, the specific part of the sheet from which the cutting was taken, and the nature of the biological material found on it have not been publicly disclosed. None of those details have appeared in any reporting. But the decision to cut a piece of a bedsheet and include it in a priority federal transfer to the FBI laboratory tells you something specific and significant. You do not take evidence like that, package it carefully, and send it to Quantico, alongside hair samples and other key biological materials, unless you found something on it. Something biological. Something that does not belong to Nancy Guthrie. Something deposited on that sheet by someone who was inside her bedroom on the night she disappeared. Think about what a bedsheet represents as a forensic surface. In a scenario where one or more individuals entered Nancy Guthrie's home and had contact with her bedroom, a struggle, a search through the room, even a person sitting on the edge of the bed for a matter of seconds. A bedsheet is one of the most productive possible surfaces for biological evidence collection. Skin cells, sweat, hair, other biological contributions depending on the nature and duration of the contact. Biological transfer at a microscopic level is invisible to the human eye. You cannot see it happening. A person can move through a room, touch a surface, sit briefly on a piece of furniture, and leave behind a complete DNA profile without any visible mark. Forensic analysis sees what the naked eye cannot. The bedsheet is at Quantico, alongside the hair, alongside the other key biological materials. The FBI laboratory's forensic biology unit is applying the same advanced analytical tools to every sample in that transfer. And what investigators need the laboratory to confirm is whether the biological material on that sheet came from someone who should not have been in that room. There is a glove, found approximately 2 meters from Nancy Guthrie's home, visually consistent with the gloves worn by the masked figure captured on the doorbell camera at 1:47 in the morning. DNA was extracted from that glove, and submitted to CODIS in February 2026. The search returned no match. Then, in March 2026, something changed. A match came back to someone from something, and as of day 79 of this investigation, the identity of that match has not been publicly disclosed. 6 weeks. A DNA match in March, and the public has been told nothing about who it pointed to. Whether that silence reflects an ongoing covert investigation, a legal process that cannot yet be made public, or a match that requires additional verification before any public statement is warranted, none of that has been explained. What exists in the public record is a match that was made, and a name that has not been shared, and in active federal investigations, that kind of silence is often where the most significant work is happening. Cecimore does not speculate. That is not a flattering characterization of how she operates. It is a precise description of her professional methodology. She is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs. Her career is built on results. She identified the Golden State Killer from a 40-year-old DNA sample. She has worked on hundreds of cold cases and active investigations using the genealogical methodology she helped develop and refine. When she makes a public statement about forensic evidence in an active investigation, it is because she has assessed that evidence carefully, applied her scientific expertise to the available information, and reached a conclusion she is confident enough to put her name behind. She has engaged with the Nancy Guthrie case publicly in ways that are specific, targeted, and scientifically grounded. And taken together, what she has said paints a picture that the summary-level coverage of this case has not fully conveyed. She said the DNA evidence from Nancy Guthrie's home is still workable. She said the Byte flashlight, the one the masked figure held between their teeth at 1:47 in the morning, is the most likely source of viable suspect DNA in this entire investigation. She said investigators should return to Nancy Guthrie's home and conduct additional swabbing of high-contact objects. She said the mixed sample found inside the home likely contains Nancy Guthrie, plus 2 or more unknowns, including at least 1 confirmed male contributor. She said the genealogical analysis process, from a workable DNA sample to a confirmed identification, could take up to 6 months. But she was explicit that 6 months is the outer boundary. When the genealogical matches are strong, when family trees are well documented, when the candidate pool narrows efficiently, identification can happen in weeks, in a few months. The critical variable is sample quality. None of those statements are vague reassurances designed to manage public expectations. None of them are the diplomatic non-answers that public figures give when they want to say something without saying anything. They are professional forensic assessments from the most credible DNA expert in the United States. And the fact that she has been making them publicly in an active federal investigation, rather than privately through consultation channels, is itself meaningful. When Cecimore names a specific object, explains the specific science behind why that object matters, and says publicly that investigators should act on it, she is not giving a casual interview. She is creating public pressure for a specific investigative action. She is using the audience as a lever. She named the flashlight. She explained why saliva transfer from a Byte flashlight is nearly inevitable. The physical mechanics of using that tool, the compression between the teeth, the saliva production, the sustained contact between the lips and the surface of the light, make biological transfer almost impossible to avoid. She said it clearly. Very difficult not to leave some behind. This person wore gloves. They covered their face. They disabled cameras. They brought their own bags and their own equipment, and they planned for the kinds of evidence that typically catch people who do what they did. But they held a flashlight in their mouth, and in that one automatic, unthinking act, they may have left the thread that unravels everything on an object sitting on Nancy Guthrie's front porch. Whether the flashlight was swabbed in the original crime scene collection, and those results are part of what is now at Quantico, or whether Moore's public recommendation prompted additional collection that has not yet been reported, is information that has not entered the public record. What her continued public focus on it suggests is that she believes it has not yet received the forensic attention it deserves. Now the CODIS question needs to be addressed directly, because it comes up in every public discussion of the DNA evidence in this case, and it is consistently misunderstood in ways that create a false sense of where the investigation stands. Earlier in this investigation, before the current evidence arrived at Quantico, the Pima County Sheriff's Department submitted a DNA profile to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. CODIS is a national database containing DNA profiles of convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic unknowns from unsolved cases across the country. It contains over 20 million profiles as of 2026. The search returned no match. Here is exactly what that result means, and nothing more. The DNA profile submitted does not correspond to any profile already in that database. That is the complete and total information a no-match result provides. It does not mean the person responsible has never committed a crime. It does not mean they are unknown to law enforcement in any other context. It does not mean the evidence is compromised or the investigation has stalled. It means only that whoever left their DNA inside Nancy Guthrie's home has not had their DNA profile entered into CODIS. Whether because they have never been convicted of an offense that triggers DNA collection, whether because they committed offenses in a jurisdiction that does not contribute to the database, whether because they have never had any criminal justice contact at all, CODIS is large. It is not comprehensive. And a no-match result from CODIS is not the end of a forensic pathway. It is the beginning of a different one. The pathway that opens when CODIS closes is investigative genetic genealogy. And the reason that pathway is available in the Nancy Guthrie case, the reason the statistical probability of identification through genealogical analysis is high, is the scale of the public databases that methodology draws from. Over 40 million profiles across consumer genealogy platforms as of 2026, a number that increases every month. Every person who orders a DNA kit to learn about their ancestry, to find relatives, to understand where their family came from, every one of those people is expanding the database that CEC Moore's methodology draws from. The person responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie does not have to be in those databases themselves. They only need one relative who submitted their DNA out of personal curiosity, one cousin, one aunt, one distant family member who bought a kit and sent in a sample without any awareness of what their genetic data would eventually connect to. Given the scale of these databases relative to the United States population, the statistical probability of at least one identifiable family connection existing is, according to forensic experts, extremely high, not guaranteed. But the odds are in investigators' favor, and those odds improve with every profile that gets added to the public databases every single month. Now consider the full forensic landscape of this investigation as it stands on day 79. And what the transfer to Quantico means for each layer of it. The blood on the front porch establishes where the confrontation began. It is Nancy Guthrie's blood, documented and confirmed, on her own front porch on the night she disappeared. That evidence is part of the foundational forensic record of this case. The third-party biological material found inside the home, the DNA that does not match Nancy, does not match her family, does not match anyone with authorized access, is what Sheriff Nanos publicly described as potentially the suspect's DNA, one unknown person's genetic contribution, documented and waiting for a name. The mixed sample, the complex layered contribution of Nancy, plus two or more unknowns, including at least one male, has been the central forensic challenge of this investigation since February. The Florida laboratory processed it without reaching conclusive results. The FBI laboratory's probabilistic genotyping software, STR-Mix and True Allele, is now being applied to that mixture, running Bayesian statistical modeling to separate the individual contributor profiles within it, and identify genetic markers that can be forensically submitted and genealogically analyzed. The hair, now at Quantico, potentially a single-source clean contribution from one specific individual, is being processed for nuclear DNA extraction. If the root is intact, the extraction process, the amplification, the STR profiling, and the generation of a complete individual profile is a relatively fast analytical process. A single-source profile from an intact root can be ready for submission within weeks under the FBI laboratory's priority processing protocols. The bedsheet cutting, also now at Quantico, is being analyzed to determine the nature of the biological material present to extract and profile. Whatever contributors are identifiable, and to compare those profiles against the genetic landscape already established by the other evidence from this case. The glove, recovered 2 meters from the home, produced a DNA match in March 2026 to an identity that has not been publicly disclosed. And the flashlight, the one that CEC Moore said investigators should be swabbing for saliva she believes is very difficult not to leave behind, may represent the cleanest, most complete opportunity to recover an individual DNA profile from the one person who managed, through gloves and face coverings and camera countermeasures, to avoid almost every other form of physical identification. 7 layers. 7 forensic stories about what happened at Nancy Guthrie's home between 9:50 p.m. on January 31st and 2:28 a.m. on February 1st, 2026. Every single one of them is either at the FBI laboratory right now or pointing toward evidence that should be. Here is what happens next. Specifically, in sequence, based on what is known about how the FBI laboratory processes forensic biology evidence in priority federal investigations. The samples have arrived at Quantico. The FBI laboratory has assigned the case to its forensic biology unit, the specialists who handle exactly this category of complex biological evidence from high-priority federal cases. The samples have been logged, inventoried, and assigned to the appropriate analytical queue based on their characteristics and the priority level attached to this investigation. The hair is likely being processed first for nuclear DNA extraction. If the root is intact, this means extraction, amplification, STR profiling, and profile generation. Potentially, a complete individual profile within weeks. If only the shaft is present, mitochondrial analysis may be the available option, which has more limited, but not worthless forensic value. The bedsheet cutting is being analyzed for the nature of the biological material on it. Presumptive testing to identify the type of evidence present. Then extraction, profiling, and if a contributor profile can be isolated, comparison against the profiles already associated with this investigation. The mixed sample is being run through the FBI laboratory's probabilistic genotyping software. The statistical modeling is working to generate individual contributor profiles from the genetic mixture, identifying enough markers from each contributor to produce forensically useful results. When profiles are ready, from the hair, the bedsheet, the mixture, or any combination, they go through a fresh CODIS comparison. Every new profile submission gets a fresh run. The February no match makes a CODIS hit unlikely, but no possibility is left untested. If CODIS returns no match and the investigation moves to genealogical analysis, the profiles are submitted to the FBI's investigative genealogy unit. The unit coordinates with Parabon Nano Labs. The matching algorithms run against the public databases. Genetic relatives are flagged, and CC Moore's team begins the manual tree-building process. The painstaking, methodical, generation-by-generation genealogical research that has identified killers who evaded justice for decades. The same methodology that identified the Golden State Killer from evidence collected 40 years earlier. CEC Moore has said this process can take up to 6 months, but she was clear that 6 months is the outer boundary. When the genealogical matches are strong, when the documentation is available, when the candidate pool narrows efficiently, identification can happen much sooner. The critical variable, the one the FBI laboratory is answering right now in a building in Quantico, Virginia, is whether the profiles coming out of this evidence are clean enough, complete enough, and reliable enough for genealogical submission. That determination is being made right now. Not eventually, right now, 79 days. That is how long it has been since the morning of February 1st, 2026, when the Catalina Foothills neighborhood woke up to the news that Nancy Guthrie was gone. 79 days of press conferences and tip lines and carefully worded statements and reward announcements and a Tucson home sitting quiet and undisturbed while the investigation it contained moved through labs and agencies and interagency disputes across thousands of miles. The evidence is at Quantico. That is the most important forensic development in this investigation since the night it began. The FBI laboratory has the probabilistic genotyping software that the Florida laboratory did not have. It has the investigative genealogy unit and the formal partnership with CEC Moore's team at Parabon Nano Labs. It has the institutional priority that comes with a federal kidnapping case involving a nationally known victim. It has the analytical infrastructure to take evidence that spent 11 weeks at a private contractor and give it the full weight of the most powerful forensic institution in the world. The mixed sample with its multiple contributors, including at least one unknown male, is being processed. The hair with its potential intact root and potential single-source profile is being analyzed. The bedsheet with whatever biological material was deposited on it by whoever was in that room is being examined. The glove DNA that was matched in March and whose identification has not been made public is part of this picture. And the flashlight that CAC Moore believes is still carrying the suspect's saliva is either already in that laboratory or waiting for the attention she has been publicly calling for. All of it pointing in one direction, toward a profile, toward a family tree, toward a name that a genealogical analysis will resolve from genetic relatives generation by generation into a living person, toward the answer to the question that has been at the center of this investigation since the morning of February 1st, 2026. Who was in Nancy Guthrie's home? There is a person out there right now who was in that home, who stood on that porch at 1:47 in the morning dressed in black, with gloves on their hands and a flashlight held between their teeth, who left biological evidence on a hair, on a bedsheet, possibly on the surface of a tool they held in their mouth, without thinking, who came prepared for almost everything, cameras, fingerprints, visual identification, but who may not have understood that the science pursuing them does not need a face, does not need a name they provided, does not need them to have ever appeared in a criminal database. The science only needs a relative, one person in their extended family who sent a saliva sample to a consumer DNA platform because they wanted to know where their grandparents came from, one cousin who took a genealogy test as a birthday gift, one family member who logged onto a website and clicked submit without any awareness of the chain they were extending into the future. T.C. Moore is building the family tree. The FBI laboratory is generating the profiles. The investigative genealogy unit is running the matches. And the person whose DNA is sitting in a federal laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, having their genetic ancestry traced backward through generations by the scientist who already did this once to a killer who thought 4 decades of silence meant safety. That person does not know exactly how close the answer is getting. The science does not stop. The trees keep being built, and 79 days in, with the evidence finally where it should have been from the beginning, the most significant forensic development in the Nancy Guthrie investigation since February 1st, 2026, is not a press conference, it is not a statement, it is not an announcement, it is a laboratory, a building in Virginia, scientists working through evidence layer by layer, profile by profile, genetic marker by genetic marker. Brian Entin told you the evidence moved. Now you know what happens when it gets there. If this investigation matters to you, if the story of what happened to Nancy Guthrie and the science that is working to answer it is the kind of true crime content you want to follow, then True Crime Files is where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a like on this video. Every subscription and every like tells the algorithm that this work matters, and it allows this channel to keep going deep on the cases that deserve more than a headline. The work is happening in Quantico right now. We will keep following it. Nancy Guthrie has been missing since February 1st, 2026. The investigation is active. The science continues.